Overnight on January 3rd, the US carried out a series of airstrikes that rocked the Venezuelan capital city of Caracas. Soon it became clear why the Trump administration had ordered those strikes. Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro was captured. The flash raid shocked the world, as the US hit Venezuela harder than anybody expected, even with the recent American naval actions close to the country. Maduro now faces a trial away from his own soil, and the big question that has to be answered is, what happens next? But before we get to the big question, let's extract the next and ask simply, what happened? Given you the basics already, the US launched a series of airstrikes. By the end, Venezuela's president was blindfolded and being flown onto American soil, leaving all of Venezuela in flux. In its January 3rd report on the operation, ABC News offered more details, stating that the US President Donald Trump announced Maduro's capture at around 4:30 a.m. on his Truth Social platform. The United States of America has successfully carried out a large-scale strike against Venezuela and its leader, President Nicolás Maduro, who has been, along with his wife, captured and flown out of the country, Trump triumphantly declared. He only added that the operation had been carried out in conjunction with US law enforcement before announcing a news conference later in the day. That post went live just a few hours after explosions were reported in Caracas. Photos and videos had already emerged of large fireballs and smoke rising into the sky, suggesting a coordinated series of strikes designed to open the metaphorical door for the US to extract Maduro. Trump commented further on the operation during an interview with Fox News, where he said, "The whole maneuver, the landings, the number of aircraft, which were massive number, the number of helicopters, the different type of helicopters, different type of fighter jets, we had a fighter jet for every possible situation," Trump claimed during the interview. He also suggested that Maduro had sequestered himself in a fortified building, though the US had planned for this and knew what to expect. And really they just broke in, and they broke into places they were not really able to be, broke into, steel doors that was put there for just this reason, and they got taken out in a matter of seconds, Trump said of the destruction of Maduro's defenses. The BBC provided a smattering of extra details in its report on the situation. It said that the US military stormed Maduro's home at around 2 a.m. local time, though it seems likely that those forces were operating in Caracas beforehand. The power had been cut for much of the city, the BBC says, though it's still unclear how America's forces managed to pull that off. Regardless, the steel-fortified safe room in which Maduro hid was penetrated, seemingly by the US military's top counter-terrorism unit, Delta Force, and Maduro was extracted or, as some report, kidnapped. The BBC says that over 150 aircraft were involved in the operation, many of which were used to get the US operatives into Caracas, and none of these operatives were hurt during the operation. As for Maduro, he was taken aboard the USS Iwo Jima along with his wife. The pair were taken to a plane, which then flew them the rest of the way to Stewart Air National Guard Base in New York. From there, Maduro and his wife were taken to a Brooklyn-based federal facility named the Metropolitan Detention Center, where they now await trial. As for the airstrikes, the BBC says that the explosions that rocked Caracas were intended as a cover for the extraction operation. However, the Independent notes that the US hit a pair of airports, La Guaira and Higuerota airports in Miranda, with further strikes appearing to have taken place at Libertador Air Base, Charallava Air Base, the port of La Guaira, and the Meseta de Marmo Naval Base. Fort Tiuna and Miranda Air Base were also hit. If these were diversionary strikes, and the US took advantage of that diversion, it used its bombs and missiles to cripple some key Venezuelan military sites. These were strikes the likes of which some could take as a US declaration of war against Venezuela. That isn't how the Trump administration is positioning what it's just done, as you'll learn in a few minutes. Still, there's no denying that the US has just ventured into legally dicey territory at best, and questions are already being asked about whether the country had any right to do what it just did at all. The US claims that it has all of the justification in the world. Reuters reports that the US Justice Department actively sought US military assistance to arrest Maduro, along with his wife, son, a pair of political leaders, and the supposed leader of an international gang. The Justice Department wants all to face charges related to drugs, weapons, and terrorism, though that may not have been the only motivation. Trump has already claimed that the US was upset with Venezuela for allegedly stealing US oil interests, though it isn't exactly clear what Trump means by this. If that secondary motivation didn't muddy the waters enough, Trump has also claimed that this operation was both a law enforcement mission and a prelude to the US either controlling or overseeing the installation of a friendlier leader in Venezuela. That alone makes the legality of the US operation against Maduro legally questionable. as Northeastern University professor Jeremy Paul tells Reuters. You cannot say this was a law enforcement operation and then turn around and say, now we need to run the country, Paul told the outlet. It just doesn't make any sense. National security law expert Matthew Waxman, who is a law professor at Columbia University, also points out that a criminal indictment in the US isn't grounds for America to simply extract the person it wants to prosecute from another country. A criminal indictment alone doesn't provide authority to use military force to depose a foreign government, Waxman tells Reuters, and the administration will probably hang this also on a theory of self-defense. These are far from the only experts who suggest that what the US has done in Venezuela violates international law. Sir John Sawyers, who is the former chief of the UK intelligence agency MI6, tells The Telegraph that the capture of Maduro is a legal stretch, and that it's something that the UK would never approve based on the questionable legality of the entire operation. In the UK, this would not have passed muster, nor in countries of Europe, because the legal base I think the Trump administration is relying upon is one of law enforcement rather than defense, Sawyers tells the outlet. In other words, Maduro's capture may have been a military operation masquerading under the guise of law enforcement. Not only that, but it's US law enforcement, which should hold no power in Venezuela. What they're relying on is US domestic law, law enforcement, and US military forces to protect those carrying out what they would see as a lawful arrest, Sawyers continues before adding, for us, that's a real stretch legally. This seems to be classic UK understatement. Sawyers may be politely claiming that the capture of Maduro was utterly illegal. In its report on the legality of the US operation, The Guardian adds that it seems likely that the US has just violated the United Nations Charter, which was signed in October 1945, with the express purpose of preventing another world war. Specifically, the US may have just violated Article 2.4 of that charter, which specifically bans any country from using military force against other countries. Former president of the UN War Crimes Court in Sierra Leone, Jeffrey Robertson, has no doubt about the legality of the Trump administration's action. The reality is that America is in breach of the United Nations Charter, Robertson says. It has committed the crime of aggression, which the court at Nuremberg described as the supreme crime. It's the worst crime of all. So is there any way that the Maduro operation could be considered legal? Beyond the US presenting this as a law enforcement operation, suggesting that it intends to use domestic US law as a justification for its actions in Venezuela, there may be another defense of the operation in play. The US may claim that Maduro's capture was designed to shut down a narco-terrorist organization that the now former Venezuelan president was accused of leading. So this would be self-defense, the Trump administration may claim. The UN Charter offers provisions that may enable one country to attack another in the case of self-defense, The Guardian says. But even then, the tensions between Venezuela and the US that seem to have led to this issue may not have been enough to allow this type of justification. There is no conceivable way America can claim, although no doubt it will, that the action was taken in self-defense. If you're going to use self-defense, you have to have a real and honest belief that you are about to be attacked by force. No one has suggested that the Venezuelan army is about to attack the United States, Robertson says. Ultimately, it appears to come down to the US arguing that alleged Venezuelan drug traffickers, supposedly led by Maduro, represented a national security threat to the United States. Your mileage will vary in terms of whether that's enough to justify the capture of Maduro. So what happens next from a legal standpoint is very much up in the air. But regardless of the issue, the fact is that Maduro has been captured and is already in the United States. The questions now are what happens to Venezuela with Maduro gone, what will happen to Maduro, and how involved the US will be in the country's future. The answer to these questions are intermingled and complicated, though we seem to know one thing for sure. There will be no further US military action in Venezuela. At least, that's according to the Trump administration. According to the BBC, the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio has claimed that what the US has done is not a war against Venezuela, though that doesn't necessarily mean that Venezuela is out of the woods from a military perspective. Much will depend on what they do next, Rubio suggests, adding that the US will maintain multiple levers of leverage, presumably to ensure that whatever Venezuela does next is favorable to the United States. Rubio has also made some interesting claims about how the US will fill the power vacuum that it's just created with Maduro's arrest. After Venezuela's Vice President Delcy Rodriguez was installed as interim president, she immediately demanded Maduro's release with the claim that he is Venezuela's only president. That certainly isn't what the US wants to hear, though Rubio claims that he is getting very different messages from Rodriguez. The US Secretary of State says that he is in contact with the new interim president and that she has already expressed her willingness to do whatever the US asks. Rodriguez's words are at odds with this claim, as she has already declared that Venezuela won't become a colony of an empire. Rubio's multiple levers of leverage comment appears to be him shooting back at an interim president who isn't playing ball. It's a confusing situation. There's a possibility that Rodriguez is simply saying what she believes that confused Venezuelan people need to hear, while she works with the US on whatever the transition away from Maduro's leadership is going to look like. However, the new interim president has also long been a member of Maduro's inner circle, the BBC adds. That raises questions about where Rodriguez's true loyalties lie. One person who seems unlikely to gain power is Marina Corina Machado, who is the leader of Venezuela's opposition, and seems like a potentially more pro-democratic person to install following the ousting of a man that many viewed as a dictator in all but name. However, the BBC says that Trump isn't likely to back Machado based on her supposedly not having the respect or support of the Venezuelan people. For her part, Machado has previously called for Edmundo González Urrutia to become Venezuela's leader. González ran against Maduro in Venezuela's 2024 presidential election, and many believe that he won. Among those many was former US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who said in August 2024, "Given the overwhelming evidence, it is clear to the United States and, most importantly, to the Venezuelan people that Edmundo González Urrutia won the most votes in Venezuela's 28th of July presidential election." None of that mattered to Maduro, who retained power anyway. Still, Venezuela may have a democratically elected leader in waiting. Whether or not that leader is installed remains to be seen. But for now, Venezuela has an interim president, though she is likely a president in name only. The US is the real power broker in Venezuela right now, and it appears to have taken charge of Venezuela in the immediate aftermath of its own strike. As Rodriguez makes her declarations, Trump has all but said that it's really the US that's in charge. "We're going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition," Trump claimed during a Mar-a-Lago news conference held in the Maduro operation's aftermath. Trump also used the opportunity to use what America did in Venezuela to send a message, adding that the extremely successful operation should serve as a warning to anyone who would threaten American sovereignty or endanger American lives. Plus, the question of further military intervention remains. Rubio may have said that the US has no intention of any further operations, but Trump suggests that it might. "We're not afraid of boots on the ground," the BBC reports Trump as stating in response to a question about deploying US soldiers in Venezuela. "It's all complicated and contradictory, though the situation seems to boil down to Rodriguez being in charge as long as she does what the US says, which essentially means that the US is in charge. For now." As for how long, there are no definitive timelines. There is also the possibility that Trump and his administration simply don't know what will come next. That's according to The Guardian's Raja Menon, who wrote on January 4th that Trump has no real control over how the Venezuelan people will react to what the US just did. As dictatorial as Maduro may have been, the US using its military to extract him from power may be seen as a massive overreach by many of Venezuela's people, even those who had no love for Maduro. Menon notes that there is now a possibility for street protests to escalate into outright clashes with what may now be seen as a weakened administration under Rodriguez. If that happens, any American hopes of using Venezuela's new interim president to achieve its goals may be dashed. The risk the Trump administration now faces could also manifest domestically. Trump won the US presidency in part on promises to put America first. The US president even made a point to state that he would follow through on his promise during his January 2025 inaugural address. Could further interventionism in a country that isn't the United States lead to Trump losing support among his followers? It's a possibility, and the BBC says that it's already becoming an issue among some of Trump's MAGA base. But domestic issues amount to a risk that Trump appears willing to take, seemingly confident in his ability to navigate the complex challenges that the US has just created. As for Maduro, the future looks bleak. He sits in a cell somewhere in Brooklyn, and it appears that the US is intent on charging him with the crimes for which it claimed that it extracted the former Venezuelan president. Al Jazeera says that Maduro is currently being questioned in New York. The Guardian adds that the White House has also posted pictures of Maduro being escorted in handcuffs by agents of the US Drug Enforcement Administration. It seems pretty clear what the nature of the charges that Maduro will soon face is going to be, and it appears unlikely that Maduro stands any chance of beating whatever charges the US will present to him. After all, the US had placed a $50 million bounty on the former Venezuelan president's head back in July, and it's unlikely that the Trump administration will allow Maduro to squirm away now that it has its man. A long time spent in prison cells seems to be in Maduro's future. However, there's one more answer to the question of what happens next that we've only hinted at so far, and it's an answer that may hint at the reason behind the reason that the US has officially given for extracting Maduro. Venezuela's former president isn't just the alleged narco-terrorist that the US paints him as being. Until just a couple of days ago, he also led a country that has massive reserves of something that the US will always want: oil, and there's a lot of it to be had by the US. Venezuela is in an interesting position of being home to an estimated 303 billion barrels of oil as of 2023, which Al Jazeera says are the largest known reserves of oil in the world. These reserves are close to 6 times larger than the 55 billion barrels that the US has. However, Venezuela hasn't been taking advantage of these vast reserves. Sky News says that the country produces less than 1 million barrels daily, almost all of which goes to China and the US, with the former receiving oil as repayment for historic loans. What we see here is a country with vast untapped oil potential, which is clearly very attractive to the US. Trump hasn't been shy about highlighting that attractiveness either. On January 3rd, the Kyiv Post reported that Trump had claimed that US oil companies would invest billions of dollars into fixing Venezuela's oil industry. Of course, that would give the US control over what happens to millions of barrels of oil, especially as the oil embargo that has caused so many issues for Venezuela in the past isn't going to be lifted. We're going to have our very large United States oil companies, the biggest anywhere in the world, go in, spend billions of dollars, fix the badly broken infrastructure, the oil infrastructure, and start making money for the country, Trump claims. It's one thing making those claims, it's quite another to see them followed through. The Guardian says that America's major oil companies have so far remained largely silent on Trump's claim. Chevron released a statement in which it said it would follow all relevant laws and regulations in the wake of Maduro's ousting. Chevron is the only major US oil player that is currently operating in Venezuela, so it makes sense that it would offer a comment, no matter how vague that comment might be. ExxonMobil hasn't responded to the Guardian's calls for comments, with another major US oil company, ConocoPhillips, only stating that any speculation now would be premature. Those companies may be waiting to find out just how severe the backlash will be for the US's actions in Venezuela. Trump, though, sees opportunity. He's gotten rid of a dictator whom he accuses of being a major part of the US drug problem. The billions of dollars that the US now stands to make if it takes control over Venezuela's oil reserves are a very happy and likely expected benefit. What happened in Venezuela is a developing situation, and more information may have been revealed by the time you watch this video. Who knows? What the US just did may have ignited tensions with Russia and China to the point where the world has just taken a step closer to a global war. If that's the case, you need to know where you have to go in the US if you want to survive a nuclear war. There are 9 potentially safe places, and you can find out all about them in our video. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more coverage of the evolving situation in Venezuela. And thank you as always for watching.